Hello and welcome to On Landscape. Any questions? I'm here with Joe Cornish and our special guest, Paul Gallagher. Hello, Joe and Paul.
Hi Tim, how are you doing? How
Yeah.
are you, Joe?
Hi, Paul. Good to see
We've got a bunch of questions off our readers, and as normal, I'll get down to things quite quickly with our first question. We got a question from Henk Goosens. I don't know if you know the name, Paul.
I don't recognise the
Uh,
name.
he,
No.
he asks an interesting one about the question says, is the work of the English landscape or nature photographers valued by the public compared with the mainland public in Europe? He's saying, I think, is there a cultural difference, do you think, between photography in the UK and photography in Europe?
I don't know much about the photographers in Europe, if I'm absolutely honest with you. I mean, I think photography in the UK is cherished, and it does paint a portrait of what the English landscape is about, and in some way helps to protect the English landscape. But in terms of Europe, I don't know really. I'm not really sure. I really don't know.
I think from my point of view, I've seen a lot of, it tends to be nature photography as descriptive. So there's a lot of people who are landscape photographers and wildlife photographers at the same time, especially in Scandinavian countries.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
But,
I'd agree. I think there's a kind of slightly bigger emphasis perhaps on the crossover between wildlife and landscape. So maybe you don't have quite such a distinction as you sometimes, it feels like, not that there were two separate schools, but landscape in the UK is I think a very strong, area. And incidentally, that question, Tim, from Hank, did it say specifically England or the UK?
It did say specifically England, yeah. So,
Well, that's quite cool. Paul, you and I have spent an awful lot of time in Scotland, and Tim, you live in Scotland, so it does feel like there's a whole kind of genre of Scottish landscape photography, if I'm honest, which maybe is something separate to English. But also, this is a question about the public reaction to photography.
Yeah.
And I think that's a
exactly.
much more complicated issue, isn't it?
It is. I mean, I'm sure it's looked at in social media and revered and stuff like that. But it's in terms of people's opinions, whether they like it or not, it's very difficult. It's very, very difficult to say. But it's certainly like you say about Scotland, Joe. I mean, it still seems to be one of the main parts of the UK that draws landscape photographers. It still does. Like, there's a lot of Scotland.
Got a hotbed in the lakes as well, I think that's it.
We have a hotbed. The lakes is getting probably a bit too busy for its own good now, I think, really.
Yeah.
I mean, I do love the lakes. There's certain parts of the eastern lakes that I kind of go to where, trying to avoid people, get out of the way, but it's a very, very popular place, very busy place now.
And actually, that would take us very rapidly into a whole other area of dispute, which is what local people think about tourism. It's a hot topic, isn't it, at the moment? You think of the protests in Barcelona and Venice and other cities in particular. But I mean, I think this is also a major issue for, let's say, Cornwall and the Lakes, and indeed, even now, parts of Scotland, I would say.
Yeah, and I think that really, really reared its ugly head during the lockdown period. I mean, parts of Scotland, it was a disgrace what people did visit in Scotland. I think some of the places that I've been visiting for many, many years, and I couldn't travel there, but you'd seen pictures, of what people had done, camping out and dumping tents and this kind of stuff. From an environmental standpoint, it was awful, but I remember thinking, "Oh no, all go home, leave the place alone, don't go up there." Like it's my kind of it's a perfect place. But people will visit Scotland; it's beautiful. But yeah, you can understand why people don't like visitors coming in. I've heard some people. We used to work a lot and base ourselves in Keswick, and even some of the people that I know that live in Keswick have said, but effectively, the tourism's almost spoilt it. It's just too busy. People, if nothing else, people park on side roads to visit the place because the car parks are full, because the capacity of the car parks was designed 20, 30 years ago. We have a lot of car parking space.
I know a few people who've moved away from the lakes because of the busyness.
For that reason, yeah. And if for one, maybe just to sort of wind up this point at any rate, to bring us back to Hank's question, I'm just really intrigued also by the idea of the public reaction, as in the general public, and thinking about how well, we think of America as being a proper marketplace for landscape photography, and also having a kind of cultural tradition of it, which is embedded actually in the arts more widely, in
Yes, it
painting
is, yeah.
and so on. And I still feel, and I'm not sure if this is just speaking as a landscape photographer, but that there is a lack of any such kind of valuing of the art of landscape photography, at least in the general public in the UK. And I wonder if that applies in Europe. I suspect it is not dissimilar, certainly more similar in Europe than it would be in the States, for example.
Yeah, it's like you mentioned, Joe, the States has always really held landscape photography in high regard. The UK has been so far behind in that. I mean, I was in galleries years ago, and I literally kind of gave up on it. I mean, sometimes it was good and they'd sell prints, and there's some galleries that perform better than others. When you actually look at the value of the investment, the time, the printing, the mounting, and all that, after a while, I thought, I'm just, is it really worth it? It's nice to get seen, but I mean, there was still a struggle because they were the type of gallery. It's not like your gallery was, Joe. There was the type of gallery where it was mostly oil paintings, crafts, and stuff like that. So you were kind of screaming from a shelf or a wall trying to get attention. And in the end, it was never really, you got the same attention that the rest of the arts did surrounding it, So
that's America's history is in photography, isn't it? Really, our history is in painting. So I think there's definitely a different attachment to photography in America.
Yeah, and it's the value of it. I think the public probably in the UK, because of that kind of history, regard like painting and crafts and as real art rather than photography. And I still think it's partly viewed that photography is a quick click and you kind of got it there, which, as we all know, that's not the case at all. But I still think it's regarded in that way. In the same way, I know some commercial photographers that are city architectural photographers that, they've lost some contracts, and when they've requested, why aren't we going forward with the contract? Oh, John from the postal room's got a really good camera, that kind of thing. It says, no, that's not quite the same thing, So there is that kind of skew on things, which is disappointing, really.
Yeah. I've got a question from Matt Payne, who is my colleague on the Natural Landscape Awards and also runs his own podcast. He's started doing his own workshops, and he's got a question about the air travel. Given the amount of air travel needed to capture the depth and breadth of your work, how do you reconcile this impact on carbon emissions? He says, as a fellow traveller who teaches photography across the world full-time now, I've been struggling with this in my own mind.
Yeah, and it's the same for me. I mean, my wife works for the Environment Agency, as did I at one stage, protecting the environment. And, I had quite a high role in that particular organisation, and now I'm flying everywhere. Sometimes it's the difference between running a business and doing what you love doing. I mean, I love the landscapes around the world, the lots of different places I've been to. But if somebody was asking me where am I most comfortable with a camera, it will be within the familiarity of Scotland, without a doubt. Or in the UK, even more so, because we just discussed about the Lake District, around Yorkshire, around the Dale, some of the landscapes around, even the borders of Scotland are fantastic. So I'm either one for age and the other one for the environment, trying to cut down on these things as much as I possibly can now. And kind of movement to more of kind of UK educational side of things as opposed to travelling. But painfully aware, I mean, I will openly admit, pre-pandemic, I was bored in over 40 flights a year, which is terrible for the environment, absolutely terrible for the environment. But I was mindful of it all the time. So there's kind of a sense of kind of guilt with it. I was like, yay, this is great going to see these places. And other people, when we got there, were happy running workshops out in these places. But I still had this undercurrent of guilt about what I was actually doing. I shouldn't be doing this. And when you ask the question, is the UK or parts of the UK as beautiful, as inspiring for me as a photographer? I'd have to answer yes, which made me feel even more guilty that I shouldn't actually be doing as much as I do.
So the demand is there, isn't it? Yeah.
Sorry?
I mean, the demand is there. People want to go to these places, and it's a question: if you didn't do them, would they not go? And I think they still want to go because it's aspirational for a lot of people.
They probably would go because it is aspirational. And then you've got to ask yourself, well, is it just for the business then? Should you be doing it just for the business? Should you not? It should be encouraging people to get on planes, essentially. That's what it feels like sometimes. But people do.
And that's the biggest worry, because I agree with you, by the way, that if let's say you didn't go, Paul, or I still travel abroad occasionally as well, and
Yeah.
still feel guilty about it. But then there was somebody who maybe wasn't interested in these issues, and therefore it wouldn't come up in conversation. And actually, I do think there is something to be said if not that one will want to do it all the time, but when you do travel, have those conversations with your group, with anybody who's interested. And the interest, I'm finding increasingly now, people are concerned about their carbon footprint. And it's partly because we know it's the one thing that we can really affect relatively straightforwardly. You can say it's a sort of low-hanging fruit of positive action. As an individual, you could fly less. But of course, the actual reality of climate change is incredibly complex, and there's so many things over which we have literally really no control: cement manufacturing, concrete, international agricultural practices, wherever we are in the world, and so on. And there is a couple of other things that are worth bringing up, I think, here when it comes to travel. And that is it, depending on where you travel. But when you do travel internationally, if you can do so in as a sort of environmentally friendly way as possible, the curiosity and the learning process is really, really can be very, very strong for people involved. And it can. I mean, certainly the polar region travel that I've done, I feel people become engaged with the issues, and especially with climate change, because it becomes very, very real for them. Whether it's the absence of animals that they had hoped to see, or the apparently very low levels of sea ice, for example, and just learning as they go, because there's always a lot of lectures on pollution and the impact of climate change now, increasingly so on these tours. So it depends on obviously on the type of tours. But I think since we can't change the world overnight, what we can do is at least keep planting the seeds of the conversation. We have to question our own carbon footprint, don't we? But also just encourage everybody to think more about it and to do what we can. But I mean, ultimately, sorry, go ahead.
Out of interest, is what with the clients you have on the international tours, why do they? How do you think you could convince them to do tours in Scotland, say, instead, or is it because why do they go abroad instead of go on short visits to the Europe or just to Scotland?
They go because it's a place it's two things. They want to immerse themselves in the culture, and the second thing they want to do is have the opportunity to photograph these places, and that's the two simple, and that's why they do it. Some people are aware of the travel to that extent, whether it's China, Japan, or something like that, has a big impact. But I think the appetite to do it overwhelms them, and they want to go and do it. And I understand that. Some of them, it's true to be said, will say things like, "Before me time runs out," that kind of thing. "I've retired. I've got the financial wherewithal to go and do this kind of thing," and so you kind of understand it. But it's even like recently we were with a group in Greenland, and it was quite a moment of poignancy. We went up some of the fjords, and the skippers of the boat were saying, just that part we passed back there a kilometre ago, the glacier snow was that far down a few years ago. You understand that, and you can see the melt out. And then it became apparent sometimes that what they were photographing was when they were photographing the iceberg was the debris, the impact of climate change. That's what they were doing. That's what they went to photograph. And so that was quite poignant. Still beautiful in its own right, but the carving of the ice and the rate at which it's increased was purely down to climate change. So there's the moments, and it's like you're saying, Joe, sometimes if you would hope that they see that real time, people may start thinking more about it. And we've all seen the Yokel Sal and the old pictures where the glacier was right forward, it's gone back again. We can all see these things. You go to the Mer de Glace in the Alps, you've got the year markers, as you further up the Mer de Glace you go, and all that kind of thing. So it's rapidly moving and quite scary, actually.
How many people on these workshops are serial foreign tour goers, or is a lot of them individual? A lot of them doing this as a one time, like once every couple of years?
It's a lot of people are very dedicated photographers and travellers, very, very dedicated, and to the extent that some of them are fortunate enough to be in a position whereby they'll do kind of 2 or 3 trips a year. Some of them, and they will go and travel and want to see all these places,
And the other thing to add, because you're asking this, Tim, is that many of them also enjoy going to Scotland.
Yeah,
so which does have a lower carbon footprint, fortunately.
Yeah.
It's still, it's still travel, and it's and I've thought about this issue so often. Our ancestors, if we came out of Africa, they essentially, spread throughout the planet, and part of what drives that human evolution is a curiosity and that sense of adventure. Maybe I'm using the not very scientific terms here, but whatever it is that makes us curious about the world and makes us want to continue to explore is still there. It's still part of us, and it's quite difficult when you have the financial means and actually your idea of life is quite strongly associated with travel, and you have the means. It's really hard to say, well, you shouldn't go, therefore, don't and do everything from home. It really is. It's an issue. It's an almost insoluble issue, I think.
Yeah.
And I think we're all hoping that one day we might have carbon-free air travel, but we're still quite a long way from that.
It's still a long way off, and it's interesting, Joe, because me and one of my friends are approaching its retirement age, are certainly discussing it. And if you were to ask, say, 10 of them, what's your aim for retirement? I'd say about 9 out of the 10 would say, I want to go travelling.
Yeah.
It's the same thing. Whether you've got a camera or not, that's what they normally say.
It's understandable. It's not just photographers, definitely.
No, it's not. It's that age group.
Well, move on to a question from Kai Thompson. It's an interesting one. He asks, does a photo have to say anything at all? And if so, how do you get your photography to say what you want it to say? Like a little question for,
How long is
a single sentence answer will do.
No, it doesn't have to say anything to photograph. A photograph can ask a question, maybe, but it doesn't have to give you information. You've got ICM and multiple exposure, and abstract photography is like that, isn't it? It doesn't have to say anything. I mean, for me, a photograph is me trying to sum up the essence of not just the place, but the experience, what the weather was like, what I felt like when I was there, what I felt of the day, the smells, the atmosphere, everything about it. That's what you're trying to say in a photograph. So I'm, in a way, ultimately trying to say that to myself when I see a finished image or a finished print in particular. So I'm trying to convey that. I get this kind of feeling when you're in a landscape, and kind of circumstantially sometimes it's not just planning, things come together, and then you'll make a composition, make the exposure, and you get the finished photograph, and you're thinking that's fantastic. And when you get that fortunate moment of happenstance and everything comes together, then you want to carry that journey along. It was the same in darkroom days, and you've got a raw file, which is often a poor cousin to what reality was like, and then you try and recreate that moment. And what I'm trying to do really is, with a photograph, is trying to have that moment back, so that says something to me, really. Whether it'll say to other people, I don't know. But sometimes a photograph doesn't have to say something, I don't think. Not necessarily.
I think it's also misinterpreting what landscape is, because the landscape. But if you're doing portrait photography, there's so much narrative involved in viewing the human face, and the human body, etc. That's automatically saying things, without really trying too hard. When you take photograph the landscape, there's a lot going on, but it's non-verbal, and it's very difficult to put words to it. But it doesn't have to be there and saying things.
Exactly. Somebody said this to me, right? You'll be able to get the message across to viewers of your work. And somebody mentioned this to me a while ago, and I said, well, actually, it doesn't matter what I try to say. They'll say what they say to themselves when they view the picture. It's their response to it.
That's so true. That's so true. I mean, I think another way to think about this is also to look at painting. You know, from, I mean, we probably know European painting reasonably well from the Renaissance, and clearly there was a time when everything was narrative, and then, you know, paintings had the intention to tell stories and have symbol and metaphor, you know, through the centuries. And some of that has depended on education, on people knowing how to read a story, whether it's a biblical story or some other kind of metaphorical story or an allegory, let's say. And landscape is a very particular kind of genre. A landscape that has sufficiently varied and clear kind of environments in it can be read. It can be read as kind of factual information about environment, about geography, if you know, you know, if you have the background knowledge and understanding of it, and if it's revealed in a way that also says something about beauty and connection, then a landscape, even quite a straight record landscape picture, can have value beyond just the surface, I think, in that way. But the message, I think, is almost, you have your own ideas of what is meaning for you. Certainly, I feel like there's this underlying sort of desire to connect with nature and to seek beauty, and those two are kind of indissoluble. But ultimately, you're dependent on the landscape itself to, you know, to corroborate or to share with you that feeling, and you can reach for it, can't you, Paul? You can't necessarily make it happen by wishing it. There's a certain amount of luck to do with the moment, the day, maybe the state of mind you're in. But I think being open to the possibility that the shape and flow and texture and space of the landscape can say something to us. If we're at least open to that, then there's a chance of it saying something. But what that says is much more likely to be dependent on the viewer than it is on what we would like to impose, perhaps.
It is, and we're going from a real life situation and experience, using all of our senses and putting all that together into a photograph. Now, when a person views a photograph, the one that we've produced, they've got their own reference points. They will make of it what they will. They might like certain colours. They might not like a certain time of day. They may, when we look at it, say the power of the ocean off the beaches of the Hebrides, they might say, "Oh my God, it looks horrible and wet and cold." So their response is going to be entirely different. So all we can do really is subtly suggest something, put some kind of seasoning in the photograph that kind of makes it feel right for us, and then it's kind of hand over them. Make of it what you will, you know, and I hope they like it. Maybe you don't want to like it, I don't know. Because the picture is good.
We also communicate quite well when we've got a set of pictures that we've done, not necessarily a project. I don't mean a project or a triptych or anything, but if we're showing pictures to somebody and we show like a book, for instance, when you see lots of pictures together, you start to draw ideas about what the photographer likes, what they're passionate about, how they interact with the world. And then knowing all that, when you look at the next picture, you read it differently based on your experience of seeing their previous pictures.
That's where the element of autobiography comes in, isn't it? You know, the photographer's personal life journey will lead them to look at the world in a particular way, and that in itself can be fascinating, definitely.
It goes back to the conversations we've had on style. The style is just who you are and what you're interested in, essentially.
It is. We can't control the way we react to a landscape, and heaven forbid we try to do that, because we're there because we love it. We want to convey that landscape. So, I mean, trying to fit that within a particular thing. I mean, we see it with some people where they go, "Oh, I've got to use this lens. I've got to do it this particular way." And think, no, don't do that. Just respond. Have a sort of kind of communion with the landscape, and don't try and fit to some individual style, because the style is how people respond and how they present the landscape. And everyone, and you know, in a sense, everyone kind of has some sort of repetitive factors in their way, but that's part of what makes them feel comfortable when they're out in the landscape. And we dip in and out of certain things and go back to using a lens or a particular approach, and then we come out of it again. And I think that's a good thing, you know. But a strict style, no, don't like that.
Where did this question start?
It's how do you get photography to say what you actually want it to say?
Oh, that's it. Yeah. Well, the answer is no idea.
No,
exactly. I mean, that's it, because everyone's different. Every view is different, so you can't really do that.
It's an emergent property, isn't it? You can't.
Yeah. It is.
You can become more interested in the landscape and know more about it to change how you interact with it.
Yeah.
And hopefully that might help communicate it. And the next question from Adam Pichala. Paul's current colour work is often understated with subtle colours and far from the oversaturated epic vistas with shouty contrast. What are your thoughts on saturation, also white balance, and how that brings out the feelings in an image? And this goes on also to probably we'll go on to talk about black and white and colour as two separate things. But start off with the white balancey.
White balance type things. You're dealing with a victim of almost 28 years of black and white. So when I went into colour, I really had to take it easy, to be honest. I didn't want to overdose in the first few years, So, and I still very much dip between black and white and colour. I'm in a black and white phase at this moment in time. But yeah, I mean, I think it's like, say you went to social media, look at social media, and I often say to groups, and sometimes when I'm lecturing, the thing with social media is that's where you get a lot of the saturated colour. So if you're going to scroll through lots of different images, be it Facebook, certainly Instagram, the way you want your image to stand out is to overcook it effectively or push it too far, make it look bright, to give it a louder voice, the loudest voice you can possibly give it. And there's no dispute that Instagram is influencing photography. Social media is influencing photography. And so if that becomes the norm for people to want their tile of images, to want their pictures to stand out, then they will turn to things like that. And for me, really, that doesn't sit comfortably with me. It never has done with my colour work. It's one of the things. We will probably talk about infrared at some stage. One thing when I went into infrared, that was a very difficult transition for me using infrared, is that I'd spent many years in dark rooms trying to get this wonderful nuance and tone, black and white. So the harshness of infrared was difficult, and I found the same in colour. Really subtle colour work for me is what feels comfortable. I don't like it screaming at you like that. I was never a big fan of Velvet. I didn't use it much, but the colours of Velvet could be quite strong at times, as you both know. So yeah, the subtlety of the colours is great. I prefer a photograph to whisper to me rather than shout in the ear, to be honest, for me.
Yeah, that's a really nice way of putting it. I was actually intrigued by Adam's mention of auto white balance, though, because I think that does imply there's a good understanding there of the way that color balance is so fundamental to how pictures look in the end. And I think, it's very easy to get lost with saturation if you don't at least understand the relation that every color picture is a series of color relationships between warm and cool, put in very simple terms, and that auto white balance is trying to deliver something to the photographer in the field that looks natural, that looks pretty much like the eye sees it. And I don't know if you'd agree, both of you, but I think that's one area where cameras have improved greatly in the last few years. So you can often, I think, rely on auto white balance to give a reasonably kind of natural looking result. It's a good starting point. Whereas perhaps 10 years ago, you might have preferred to put it on daylight, knowing that you would get a cast, quote unquote, and then manage to cast in a way that is compatible with your own memory. Because I think ultimately, with RAW files, you have the most important resource you have is your own memory of color.
It is.
What seems and feels natural. And naturalism is a starting point. I'm not saying it has to be naturalistic. That's my preference. But I think if you don't understand that from this, then it's difficult to head off in a direction and have a reasonable level of control, especially when it comes to emotion, which I think was also part of Adam's question, is how we manage that and how we work. And actually, I do like to think of the warm, just purely in terms of color, because clearly there's tonal questions as well, dark and light, but warm and cool. We can choose to give a little bit of a cast in one direction or another, and that will certainly be the starting point of guiding the kind of emotional content of the landscape photo.
Yeah, but it's one thing I find with a lot of digital, even good quality digital cameras, is that regardless of the white balance, the greens tend to be a blue green. They do tend to be quite a cool green, and
Yeah.
most of the time, that's in some way, to some certain degree, has got to be addressed. That green, and obviously, this time of year is not particularly favourable for landscape photography because it's that dull green that's out there everywhere. But sometimes you can still be tempted to go in a woodland beneath the canopy and photograph it, and that colour balance can throw it off completely. The other thing that sometimes I like people to avoid is when they load like the colour preset, like Provia in Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom, and they load these things. And I often say, what you're saying rightly so, Joe, about memory. When we're presented with the file, a raw file, then it's very easy to assume that's the benchmark and then move forward from that. Well, that's it. The colours are kind of maybe warm or cool, but that's it. And sometimes they can be, from reality, they're not actually quite close to reality at all. They need altering straight away. Yeah.
Greens especially.
Yeah, especially greens, yeah.
I remember old the Canon cameras, like the Canon 5D Mark II, had very yellowy greens, and that's like, it seems like Nikon have gone the other way now. All the colours have gone very bluey greens.
They've gone very blue, yeah. So the Z series are very blue green, yeah.
Yeah. And they typically need darkening and desaturating, I think, to try and turn them down, and that seems to be a default thing. I think that's probably a difference with how our eyes see compared with how the digital camera sees.
And it does depend on the environment too. I mean, I would agree, Tim, but I also think there are exceptions, and occasionally the greens need to be a little bit lighter, for example. But what is quite common is that they need desaturating. I think that otherwise, I think our eyes are so sensitive to it, and I'm pretty sure our brains kind of dial back the greens. I mean, I'm looking out the window here at a lovely scene of southern England. It's been pretty wet summer and everything, and there are. I mean, it's just green everywhere, but I'm pretty sure it looks natural to me. I'm pretty sure if I took a picture of it, the raw file would be far too saturated.
Here's something very weird I had with greens when I started getting into colour, and I was doing my I do a lot of colour negative inversions from scratch for my scanning work, and so I wanted to see what colours things were, and I got the spectrophotometer out and started looking at, and I think I had a Pantone set of colours. And I went outside to look at grass, and you think grass, it's fairly green. I couldn't actually get a monitor or even the Pantone set to match how vibrant green grass is. It's just insane. And yet, when you look at it, it doesn't look that green. So I think there's a very strange perception thing going on.
It's the brain, isn't it? The eyes and the brain and how we perceive it. And it's like, we go out, we can go, certainly talking about the Lake District, the rolling hills of the Lake District, it's green, everywhere is green. You take a photograph of it and you can come back and try and manage the greens in it. And when you see it on a monitor, it looks like everything's green, but when you're there, it's kind of not as overwhelming. When it's digitized and even printed, it's just too green. And I think most landscape photographers have gone through that process of maybe going to enjoy the good weather and going out to these nice places, and got back, and when they've been bombarded with the green, they're thinking, I probably won't bother with summer photography very much. I've done that process, I'm not doing it again.
Well, you were saying how July is like just horrendous, isn't it? A lot of the time for photography. I've had to do quite a bit of professional work at this time of year, and actually, at least with digital photography in a raw file, you've got the magenta green tint slider in the white balance, and I often end up with about plus 40 magenta, so just to make them look natural. And you can do that, and then look at the neutrals, which now have got a bit of a magenta cast, and then just desaturate those. And I often feel that's quite an effective tactic to produce something that looks really, really, really natural. But I don't know if that answers Adam's question, Tim. Was that the last point?
I think so. He says he tends to stick to daylight or even 5300K, so sort of like cool but not ridiculously cool, and it's like a cloudy daylight. I must admit, I do the same mostly as a way to start off with. And then I'll sometimes just go in an auto white balance to see what the difference is between the two.
Yeah, between the two,
I think everybody has, or the one other solution I was going to come up with was probably the next question for Paul, which was to shoot in black and white in this month of the year. But certainly, I was out with my camera yesterday in a beautiful woodland in the New Forest, and it was raining for a lot of the time, and black and white was definitely the way to go because everything was far too saturated, literally and metaphorically, but it worked great in black and white.
Just a quick question before we go to the black and white color question.
Yeah.
Joe, when you print things, do you see a difference in saturation if you print really big to small? Because I've read a couple of times, and I think I've done a couple of tests where when you do bigger prints, they don't need as much saturation and contrast, and as it gets smaller,
is that a perception thing, though, Tim? Is that a perception thing, do you think?
It is a perception thing, I think. I think what it is when you have a really big print, the areas of colour get bigger.
Yeah.
So they become more impactful. So they don't need to be as strong to have the same effect. And I wonder if that's why a lot of the fine art photographers...
I do think that's the reason. And the other, I've actually never thought of that before, but I think the equivalent is that when you print larger, you can print darker as well.
Yeah.
And that's
see this tonal content in the shadows.
Yeah, I think it opens up the shadows. Is that to do with dot gain, or when you print smaller? I don't know. But small prints, if they're printed at what works for a really, really big print, it often will look too dark.
It might be like the thing when you get a 5/4 transparency on a light box.
Yeah.
It looks really contrasty, and the blacks are really dark. But if you crop off the blacks with a mask, all of a sudden you can see all the tonal detail in there. So it
may be to do with if you isolate things.
Yeah, and if you've got a big print, you're naturally isolating parts of it.
When you're looking at big print, it's immersive, isn't it? It's filling your kind of peripheral vision and so on. And you can take really, really dark shadows as long as there's something there. But those shadows do tend to fill in with a smaller print. And I wonder if that's how that relates to color, Tim. I've not heard that before, though. That's really interesting.
Yeah, it's similar to the when you see, and I'm teaching people black and white, and they'll be in Lightroom or Adobe Camera or Photoshop, whatever, and they go full screen, and the background's like that dark grey or black. And I've often said you can't assess the tones of a black and white image with a black background. You just cannot do it. And there's been a few times we've been teaching it, and they go, I think this is just right. I think this looks just right. And I'm going, that's fine. Can I just change the background colour? And they'll click it. It goes to white, and you go, oh, it looks rubbish now. Like it was my fault. I haven't done anything. But we've got to work with the white background because that has the same effect. It throws comparisons out completely, at tones completely throws it out.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for printers, a white background is essential as a default. It really is. I mean, by all means, view things for viewing, for displaying, and so on with a darker background. But for analyzing the tonal values of an image, you really do need a white ground.
Yeah, definitely, yeah.
Question about colour in black and white. Are you working more in colour or black and white at the moment, Paul? Or is it?
At the moment, it's probably a split of 50-50. As of the last few weeks, months, it's probably been basically all black and white, to be honest.
Yeah, that condition is dependent then.
It is kind of conditions. I think black and white. It's like a sort of like a big sort of like springy rope. Like what's they call it now? When you jump off buildings and
bungees.
Bungee, yeah, it's like a big bungee, and it pulls me back all the time. I'll never escape it, and that I don't mind. I don't mind that in the slightest. So I really enjoy colour. I'll explore colour, but at the moment, I'm probably doing more black and white than I am colour. Definitely at the moment. Yeah.
And the majority of your work, when you're taking it, do you have an intent when you're taking pictures as to what it will be?
Normally. But I think part of that is because when I'm almost like let's say you've got like two pairs of eyes. I'll see things in colour. I'll be using colour within the frame, the balance of the colour, the flows of colour through the frame. But when it's black and white, it's I'm just looking at luminosity. And so part of black and white is like pre-visualising it. To do good black and white, to gain and understand the pre-visualisation is really important because if you just try and, if you haven't got that and you convert it to black and white when you get back, a colour file to black and white, and you haven't pre-visualised it, then we can't really possibly assess what it's going to look like in black and white. You're just hoping it'll work out when you get it back. So if I go out with the intent, or I happen upon an environment where I think I want to work in black and white, then I'll start pre-visualising in black and white.
Just put your black and white glasses on.
Black and white glasses on, yeah, that's what I do. It's amazing though, because I think mentally what happens, I'm just looking for luminosity, I'm looking for brightness and dark and texture. Weight and balance becomes a hugely important part of the composition I'm making. And I've found myself, say I've been in a particular environment where I've done some colour work, when I decide to work in black and white, the way I'm pre-visualising things, I'll make compositions that, if I flick back to colour, they never would have worked in colour. But in black and white, they'll work. They'll work very well because I'm using light, different surfaces, different textures and things like that. So I like to flip between the two. But generally, I will go out and I will aim to work solidly in black and white. Mostly the reason is that I miss it. If I don't do it for too long, I miss it and I've got to go back.
Is it hard to switch in the field? I mean, if you're going out for a session or a day, do you tend to stick in a mode?
It can be. What you tend to get is a continuous switch. So if I'm out and I'll start photographing, say, in colour, and I'll switch to black and white, then kind of, because the pre-visualisation thing, I'll just stick with black and white probably for the rest of the day, and something will have to switch me back.
Yeah.
That's generally it. But sometimes there's no dispute in the fact that there's certain places and environments you're in and situations whereby the beauty of the colour is just, you can't question it. And that's when it's good, because when I was working in large format black and white film, I never really had that choice, but now I can. I've got that choice to explore it in colour and celebrate the colours, and that's really, really nice.
Can you visualise the filter changes in your head a bit as well, like red, orange, or yellows, or things like that?
Kind of, but I don't really need to do that nowadays.
Yeah.
For obvious reasons. Yeah, I don't really need to. Nowadays, in the past, you could kind of put the filter on for what you want, and everyone seems to think, it's great to use a red filter, but it often wasn't good to use a red filter whatsoever, because things were far too contrasty. And that's the one thing I didn't want to get. But nowadays, I mean, it's the weight and balance, the tonality of it, using luminance, light bouncing off surfaces. That's all we do with photography. But when it's black and white, that's the main thing you're interested in, is the brightness of light that's being reflected off surfaces. So as long as we get a good file, you get it back, then that's great. But the colour information is still useful, obviously. If you're shooting with a digital camera and it's a colour file, that colour information is also very useful. But it's less important than the brightness range in the scene, I find.
Yeah, one of the things about black and white that's great is that I think if we look back in the history of photography, think of mid-20th century photography, in terms of landscape, it tends to be dominated by the Americans and Ansel Adams in particular, and a lot of his pictures were made in what we would regard as overly harsh conditions. Often in bright sunlight with strong contrasts, and he was able to control that relatively easily, using, classical techniques of exposure and development. And, and it is fascinating that opens up a whole field of creativity, which, I can't really go out I couldn't go out in this weather and shoot pictures in color. I mean, it's just too bright and sunny. And there's no mood, and there's no kind of there's no subtlety. It's very crass somehow. And so I love that, the flexibility of photography like that, and the fact that black and white gives you a whole other language to play with.
Because when the weather's really sunny, you've got the bright light, which is the component that can be useful for black and white. But if you're shooting in colour, then you've got the bright light reflecting the bright colours, and that becomes the overload. But if you discount the colours, then you can play with the tones. So you can celebrate the bright light by getting rid of the colours, which is a great thing to do. So certainly on sunny days, put the colour camera away.
About printing, question about printing colour. I'm currently putting together the Natural Landscape Awards book, and we have a black and white category, and a few black and white ones get through in the normal categories as well anyway. When it comes to printing them or preparing for the book, quite often the the black level can vary in the files quite a bit. People are not as consistent. When you're mastering for that, do you tend to try and get a dense black, a solid black, like 000, or do you normally have a lifted black to?
I normally have a lifted black. I mean, maybe it's the kind of the original black and white approach I made was like with negatives and printing and darkroom printing. Having solid blacks for me, I want to be able to see every tone, so having solid blacks for me doesn't work. I don't like it. It can be used very effectively. There's some photographers have used it just a solid area of black. I don't like that because really, when you see a photograph, I'd like the viewer to look not at it but into it. And if you've got areas of solid, certainly black and white, solid tonality, solid blacks, or things, then it becomes like a barrier to viewing the photograph, and therefore that kind of looking into it through a photograph is kind of lost. So I like to keep the tonality right down at the tippy toe, right down into the edge of black, but not completely into black.
Yeah.
So
just
not too dark.
Keep it open at those bottom levels.
Yeah, and it said even good digital, black and white photographers and digital printers that can understanding the capabilities of the media they're using, like fine art media generally kind of can't produce the same into black and white the same tone ranges of say brighter paper. They've got more variation in the darker tones, and it's understanding what that means when you're processing an image as well. So on the computer and understanding how the blacks will represent themselves in the finished print. So there's all them kind of things. That sounds really techy, but if it's about producing a print that you want them to experience it in the way that you chose because you're the photographer, and producing it in that particular way is quite important to me. Yeah.
But sorry, just to jump in, I think that's really fascinating because what you're telling us, Paul, is that the black, or what I call flat black, i.e. black 000, essentially keeps the eye on the surface. It doesn't allow you to really explore into the image, which I think is what I would call, the philosophy of immersion, is getting really connected with the subject. And whereas, let's say, solid black, 000 black, it will tend to create an image that's more like graphic design, where there might be some spectacular effect from it, but it doesn't connect so much with the subject. And we're talking about usually nature and landscape in that sense. So I think there's a clear philosophical direction there in your photography. You said it was might sound technical, but actually it doesn't. To me, it sounds, essentially it's based on concept and sentiment. What's the feeling that you're looking to create in the work?
Yeah, and I think it's true. I've produced over the years quite dark images of dark scenes, and it's almost on the edge of black. So they've been richly printed. I've elected to print them quite dark as a representation of when I was there. And sometimes it could be like a very dark woodland at the end of the day, and it's almost black. But the one thing that will attract the viewer's eye into the dark shadows is just some discernible information in there. They'll dive into the shadows and look at this, and it's the surest thing to draw them in to the picture, because people look at shadows in kind of nature, the darkest shadows in threatening places. Yeah. So they kind of look at the darker areas, and they do that when they look at prints. So if they see the finest detail, their eyes go straight into it. If it's printed solid black, the best thing it serves as is telling the viewer what the texture of the surface of the paper is, because it almost comes reflective.
Exactly.
That's what it does. So for me, that's the reason why I don't go there,
Yeah, what you're describing is what Charlie Kramer calls mysterious black. It's really good.
It's true. Yeah, very, very true. Very, very true.
One question on books before I go to the next question in printing still is what's your opinion of the CMYK blacks versus doing blacks with multiple greys or tones? Have you done both, I presume?
I have over the years. The multiple greys and tones, I've not really seen much benefit in it. Really. I've really not seen much benefit in it. It's a while since I've had to go with it, and I've tried it. It's a long, long time. But from my experience, not a lot of benefits in it, really.
Yeah. So we go to CMYK black and white's fine.
Yeah, I would, yeah, definitely.
Right, I did have another question from. Do you still use perspective control lenses? I'm looking back at your old large format things, and the approach there is
not as much as I do. Not as much as I used to, should I say? I do still use them. I still carry them around. The lens. I mean, when you look at it, oh my god, it's been around the world and how many times? There's hardly any black paint left on it, to be honest. It's all the controls are gone, but I do still use it sometimes, occasionally. If I'm doing something very near far, then I'll use it. Or I'll
24, is it?
It's just a 24. Yeah, I mean, I've never owned a 45 or the 90s or anything like that. Just as well, I've used it occasionally, but I use it less and less and less.
Yeah,
and I think the reason being because it started. I didn't want to. The equipment started to influence what I was photographing. So it was almost tarnishing my vision, my pre-visualization. Oh, it's 24mm tilt and shift. Put the camera on 5:4 crop and go vertical. And I thought, no, I don't want to start doing this. And the other reason being is that I started enjoying it too much, and then it became over familiar.
Yeah.
And then I thought, no, I don't like this. So I had to kind of like wean myself off it, but, move back from it because I started doing the same thing. And pre-visualization, you're doing that. You can do that with a lens like that. You start looking at what's in the first 3 meters in front of you, and how can I compose that with the distance? And you walk along and do the same thing, And then one day I thought, I'm going to put an 80 to 400 on and throw it out to 300 or 400mm. And then what I found is that then what was before me was a mosaic of different landscape compositions because I'd stretched into the landscape. And so it's good to switch between the two. But I use it less and less nowadays.
Do you focus bracket if you need it, or do you just stop down more?
I just stop down a bit more. I've done some focus stacking in the past. Not too much of it, but yeah, I'll just basically use a tilt shift really near far, and if not, use those lenses.
Last question I was going to ask is, what are the best and worst things about leading workshops? And I'll ask that for you and Joe.
The best and worst thing is normally the people. No, I shouldn't say that. No, it's as I get the worst thing as I get a little bit older is the tired. To be honest, lots of travel. Whereas I used to come back from the States and I'd like 2 days be fine, and now I'm like a week later I'm still plowing through and I'm getting a bit tired. So that's probably one of the worst thing. One of the best thing is seeing people's excitement about seeing a place for the first time, and helping them. Me saying, listen, let me show you what I do here. Let me work with you on this. And that's the best thing. That's what I enjoy the most, and the rapport with the group as well. I mean, I'm a kind of chatty guy, so I like being around people and enjoying people. I've always enjoyed that, and so to be within a group of people is fantastic. And most people, running workshops, they enjoy that. They enjoy that because the individual people essentially coming together for the first time, and they want to get along. They generally 99.9% of the time do get along. And to be a part of that's an uplifting thing. And just talking all photography, it's good fun. But tiring at the same time.
What about you, Joe?
Well, I can echo a lot of what Paul said, certainly about it being tiring when you get to my age. I mean, I can corroborate what Paul's saying about being chatty. He is one of the most wonderfully convivial workshop leaders you could ever work with. If you go on a workshop with Paul, I don't have to do anything. He just basically does all the talking. I mean, I actually think that for me, I also feel that I learn so much from it. I think that's the thing I've loved. And also really, really lucky that almost everyone who comes on workshops is really nice, and even if they're not, you get on with people fine. But almost all my clients, I would say, are wonderful people, and just you learn so much from them. But you also just learn about photography, about talking about it, articulating. I mean, we were talking earlier. What does your photography have to say? Something. That's a conversation we have a lot out in the field. And how do you translate that? Well, it's an unanswerable question, but it's great fun to try. The techniques, and of course the pleasure of, especially of revisiting places that you know and love, and they're never the same. I think increasingly I'm finding, I mean, this isn't quite answering the question directly, but that I go to Scotland a lot, and also on my back doorstep in North Yorkshire, and I'm now really noticing things differently as I'm getting older. Maybe it is just to do with age, but appreciating the subtleties and the subtle changes. And there are changes. The landscape is always changing, regardless of climate change. It's changing because things grow and die, and rocks fall down and cliffs fall down, and agricultural practice produces it. Now, on the whole, we're getting more wild plants evolving as a result of less pesticide use, for example. So there are all sorts of interesting aspects to it, and I think that that's to do with appreciating the incredible beauty and subtlety of our world. And that I feel very grateful for the opportunity to do workshops, because you are encouraged to want to help others to connect. And then you find yourself focusing on these things and becoming more curious about them. So, I think the learning process lasts forever. And that's something to be very grateful for.
It's true, Joe. And I think the other thing for me, and I'm sure you've probably experienced it many times as well, Joe, is seeing through other people's eyes. I mean, sometimes we do like an image review, and it's fascinating. I've been to Melon Beach or some part of Scotland and a woodland, and I've photographed it. And I'd never say it's kind of exhausted, it's being done. I don't believe that. As to go on what you just said, Joe, it never stays static. Nature changes all the time. But I'll go back somewhere, and there'll be a photographer, and they'll see it with a fresh pair of eyes, or it's their first interaction with a particular beach or mountain path or something, and they'll photograph it. And I love the moment when you think, how did you see that? I've been here for 20, 30, how did you see that? I said, that's great, that. Because it's refreshing. It refreshes the place you've been to many times. And it sows them seeds in your minds. They kind of sit there, but it sows a seed of thought about how other people see. The one thing, as a landscape photographer, it would be great if you could have a fresh pair of eyes. We can't. We've got all these templates that we built up over decades and decades, and we kind of refer to them and try and break away from them. But a fresh pair of eyes, that's what you see through clients, and it's great. And they'll experiment and do things that it's not that I would have refused to do, I wouldn't have thought of doing in the first place. And that is a reward in its own right. Great reward for a leader.
Absolutely. And it's brilliant that other people, also in turn get inspiration from you, when you're with them. But yes, isn't it fascinating that we do all see differently? And I think that actually the ultimate sort of sense of creativity is realizing that instinct, whatever draws you, whatever you see and you want to photograph, that's what you should do, rather than feeling an obligation. I think trying to get convey people that they should have the confidence to believe in themselves and to see that it's actually what catches, just as simple as what catches your eye, and then figure out how you make a picture of that. And that's where those of us who are lucky enough to lead will often learn, as you say, from sort of other people find a fascination for a different way of seeing. It might be compositional, it might be textural, color, or something to do with the way they just read the landscape. And that is, it's fantastic. It's at the heart of creativity, really.
Yeah, and we get, sometimes you get a member of a group that is first out the minibus and they're off. Like they walk off miles, and so they won't be on that beach or in that wood. They'll wander off somewhere. And they're in the environment where we stopped, and they may have like 2-3 hours to explore it. And that's the person I always want to see what they've done. I want to see all the way. But if there's 6 other people walked onto the beach, and there's one guy like right at the top of the dunes 2 miles away, can't wait to see what he's done. But he's seen something different, That's very exciting. That's very exciting to do.
It is.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Joe and Paul, for that
You're welcome.
brilliant session. We could have carried on for a lot longer, but try and keep it down for now. Maybe we'll do another one in a few months' time.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. It's absolutely fascinating to listen to.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thanks for inviting me. I've really, really enjoyed it. Really.